So, as I sit here becoming an old man, I sometimes forget that a lot of you, even hardcore Star Wars fans, don't remember life before the prequels. And hey, it's not your fault. Many of you, weren't born yet, which is totally fair. But I remember just how interested I was in The Phantom Menace because I wanted to see what the Jedi were like at their height before they were wiped out. In the original trilogy, it's basically just Obi-Wan, Yoda, and I guess Vader from that era. And even back then, you sort of got the impression that the two former were kind of just a shadow of what they had been. That makes The Phantom Menace's opening just so much more exciting. You see two Jedi in action during a mission, and only several minutes into the movie, we get something not quite completely new, but pretty incredible, and that is the Force Run sequence. I say this isn't completely new because there was a similar moment or two in the original trilogy. I think the most prominent one would be where Luke jumps out of the carbon freezing chamber. He's clearly getting an extra bit of juice there, but the scene in The Phantom Menace, especially combined with the lightsaber choreography we see, really makes the Jedi in their prime feel more like superheroes, for better or for worse. So why was Force speed pretty much left in that scene? We don't really see it throughout the rest of the prequel trilogy. Well, let's talk about it. And I do want to acknowledge, first of all, that although Force speed has been somewhat limited in the films, it has appeared in other media. For example, if you've played Knights of the Old Republic, you've probably used Force speed to help with some of your backtracking. We see the same thing in the Jedi Knight series. I actually really like the depiction there where people kind of slow down. You go fully Sonic the Hedgehog. We see it plenty of times as well in the original Clone Wars TV series. Mace Windu does it explicitly, but just the way the characters move, Force enhanced speed is sort of implied generally. In the full Clone Wars series, we also see characters who are clearly Force enhanced, but there are also explicit inclusions of Force speed. So with that said, one of the reasons why we don't see Force speed used more often is simply because it doesn't always look very good visually, and I think that was true in The Phantom Menace. Obviously, the computer effects of that era were more limited than what we have now, but I think the Kylo and Rey duel on Keef Bir also showed us that even with more advanced special effects, these profoundly big Force movements can at times look a little goofy. So while we don't see the straight zipping and dashing like we do so much in The Phantom Menace, what we do often see is individuals clearly physically heightened by the Force so that they can swing faster, move faster, just be faster than an ordinary human being. And I'll come back to that in just a second because there is actually in-universe lore that supports that point. But from a filmmaking perspective, what's the point then of including this one scene if it's only going to really exist by implication later on and we're not going to see it in the same explicit way? Well, I think it's pretty simple. George Lucas is trying to show us that the Jedi at the height of their power have a command of the Force which is incredible. These are true warriors, and it's a fairly stark comparison to what we see of Obi-Wan and Vader, for example, in Episode 4. Another great example of this would be Yoda, who spends most of his time in the original trilogy standing or lying around, and he's clearly using Force-enhanced speed in his duels with Dooku and Palpatine, like the man is throwing himself around the battlefield. It's not his physical muscles alone which are accomplishing that. But again, the real answer is that Jedi and Sith and Force users generally, when fighting, are using Force speed to some aspect the entire time. It may not be a Force power specifically called Force Run or Force Sprint, but they are using the Force to enhance their actions. If you've ever read a Star Wars Legends book, especially one featuring Luke, you'll hear references to how the Jedi is using the Force to replenish his muscles, to push his body beyond the physical limits, and that's essentially what Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are doing in that one scene, just to a very dramatic effect. That's why in the Clone Wars, when you see Jedi fighting among droids, they look so fast, because the point of reference for who they're fighting is not another Force user. But when you've got Anakin and Obi-Wan both relying on the Force, fighting at superhuman levels, well, it almost sort of equals out a bit. In the most intense moments, like for example the last stand of Ganner Rosodi during the Yuuzhan Vong War, the individual really just becomes a vessel for the Force itself, even continuing to fight or push their body beyond the point where they would have otherwise died. They usually will die afterwards, or at the very least be very, very tired if they haven't received a mortal wound, but that's just sort of an explanation of how the Force is always, to a degree, influencing the action of a trained Force user and allowing them to fight. This is something talked about a lot during the Darth Bane series. Even before he's received formal training, Darth Bane, as a powerful individual, was unconsciously relying on the Force to help him fight. Back on Apatros, his latent abilities in the Force had allowed him to anticipate and react to the moves of his foe. Here, however, every opponent enjoyed the same advantage. As a result, victory required a combination of the Force and physical skill. Bane had worked on acquiring that physical skill over the past months. As the ability grew, he was able to develop less of his mental energy to the physical actions of thrust, parry, and counter thrust. This allowed him to keep his mind focused so he could use the Force to anticipate his opponent's moves, while at the same time obscuring and confusing his enemy's own precognitive senses. In the duels, you'll often hear him talk about how the Force is augmenting his strength. His already great strength is what it usually says because he's completely jacked. But that also ties into why the greatest sword masters really learn one or more lightsaber styles to perfection. They want their movements, as Bane alludes to be subconscious, so they can focus not only on that precognitive aspect, but also using the Force to enhance their physical abilities. By the way, that novel also talks about how the Force is otherwise used in combat. Maybe I'll do a full video on this looking at other sources, but if you've ever wondered why the Jedi and Sith don't just Force grab lightsabers from each other, well, I'll read a brief quote. One of the first lessons Kasim taught students was how to build a protective shield around themselves in combat to prevent an enemy from using the Force against them. A Force-talented opponent could yank away your lightsaber, knock you off balance, or even extinguish your blade without the touch of a hand or weapon. A Force shield was the most basic and necessary protection there was. It had become instinctive for all apprentices, almost secondary nature. Guarding against the Force powers of the enemy and obscuring your own intentions required as much concentration and energy as augmenting your physical prowess or anticipating the moves of your foe. But continuing, the greatest Force users, the masters, the naturally very gifted, are able to pull on a deeper pool of the Force. But for no individual, except in very rare situations, is that pool unlimited. What Obi-Wan and what Qui-Gon did in The Phantom Menace was not just an ordinary bit of Force augmentation, as I'm talking about here. It clearly was something distinct, like they leave, they just peace out. That would have required an extreme amount of energy, because not only are they sustaining the movement for a long time, they're pushing their bodies far beyond what they would ordinarily be capable of. So the question about, well, why didn't Obi-Wan use that Force sprint in the duel of Qui-Gon versus Maul when he stuck behind those doors? To put it frankly, he probably just didn't have the energy at that point. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon in The Phantom Menace at the beginning use it as like a last-ditch survival thing when they begin to be overwhelmed. If they had waited too long, it may not have been possible. Obi-Wan perhaps knew that he just didn't have the energy to do it at all, or that if he did draw upon the Force and sprint like that, he would have had nothing left on the other side. And I think that is the difference between superheroes and Jedi. That is an important aspect, and I do think ties into why Lucas chose to show us this at the very beginning. He sets us up with a look at the Jedi, then through 3 films, and even really just The Phantom Menace, that becomes deconstructed. So Force speed didn't go anywhere. The special effect didn't look great, so they don't throw it in arbitrarily very much anymore. But in a way, it's also more common than ever. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours down below.